Thanks for coming. It's a small but hopefully appreciative audience, and I will say some of the nicest sessions I've had have been with small audiences. The size of the audience and the quality of the conversation don't necessarily line up, so we'll try to make it memorable. I'm going to take a passage I've read a million times before because there are very few passages in the book that stand on their own. And I'd like to obviously serve up something vaguely coherent. So this is a passage which occurs early on. My book is centered on a white South African family called the Swarts, which is a bit of an in-joke if you're South African, because it means black. But the Swarts are a very disparate bunch, not a happy family, what you'd call highly dysfunctional, I guess. And this is a sequence that comes early on where we see them in their various bedrooms sleeping, and we get a little window into their dreams. It is night, the same night, but later the stars have moved on. Only a cuticle of moon casting the faintest metallic glow onto this landscape of rocks and hills, making it look almost liquid, a mercurial sea. The line of the main road is stitched out now and then in slow motion by the headlamps of a car, carrying its cargo of human lives going from somewhere to somewhere. The house is dark, except for floodlights fore and aft, note the nautical terms, illuminating the driveway and the lawn, and a single lamp left on inside in the lounge. In the various rooms downstairs, everything is mostly inert, except for the occasional scuttling insect, or is it a rodent, and the tiny expansions and contractions of the furniture. Pitter, patter, creak, crack. But upstairs, in the bedrooms, there is a flickering going on. Pa's mattress is a raft, tossing on a current of uneasy dreams. He has taken a sedative prescribed by Dr. Raff, and it keeps his head just under the surface, looking at images refracted from above. His wife is in many of them, but altered somehow, a bit squiff. A trace in her of another person altogether, someone he doesn't know. How can this be? He cries to her. You're dead. That's an unforgivable thing to say, Mani, she tells him. I'm very hurt. His heart is wrung like an old rag. I'm sorry, I'm sorry. Through the wall beside him, just an outstretched arm away, Astrid ripples in her sleep. She has recently lost her virginity to a boy she met at the ice rink, and sex flows through her like a golden wind. She has forgotten the pain, though it's part of the shimmer around the faces of young men with their bristly beards. And in this dream, around the face of Dean de Wet in particular, whose mouth is a pink color it doesn't have in waking life, thrilling her deep inside, down where everything meets. In the guest bedroom, Tani Marina dozes and starts, dozes and starts. She achieves only the beginning of a dream in which she's on a picnic with P.W. Botha at an old fort somewhere, and he's feeding her strawberries with thick white fingers, before she gets woken by a kick. At home in Menlo Park, she doesn't share a bed with Oki, who lies twitching beside her like a hit-and-run victim waiting for medical assistance. What a thought, Marina, sis on you, but you can't help what you think. It's only human. And far worse has gone through your mind. Oh, yes, it has. Her husband's foot touches hers. She pulls her foot away. Terrible to flinch from what you once briefly loved or thought you did or wanted to think you did, but are shackled to regardless for life. At the other end of the chain, Oki jerks like a dancing bear. He doesn't dream, not exactly, unless the shallows he splashes through are a sort of dream, but nothing quite happens. There's just the question of color changing all the time. A bubble rises from the seabed, becomes a breaking of wind against the flank of his wife, who stiffens and flares her nostrils in protest. And in her bedroom at the end of the passage, Amor lies sleepless, hour after hour. Not unusual for her, believe me. Every night before she drifts off, her mind must move outward from where her body is based, on its back, in bed, to reach out and touch certain objects in particular places in a specific order. Only when she's done that can she relax enough to let go. But tonight, it doesn't work. Other images from the day are too powerful. They come jostling in, Miss Starkey's pressed together lips, Lucas's stick hitting the ground, the sore place on her arm where her aunt pinched her, so much rage in her fingers, sending out its little pulse of pain into the universe. Notice me, I'm here. Amor Swart, 1986. May tomorrow never come. I'll leave it there. It's enough. You took the right chair, apparently, because you're under the fan.
Oh, maybe we need a hand fan or something.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's all right. I'm sexier when I sweat.
Damon, one of the things reading the book, which is sort of it inspired this kind of envy, because there's so many things that you're doing with character, with the nature of time, the way that you zoom into certain events and the way that we move. And as someone who's writing fiction, it's just sort of, you think about the structure and you think about the architecture, and this is a perfect novel in many ways. And I wanted to start by asking something, you know, this question of writing fiction. There is this sense when you begin that it might get easier because you figure it out. And I've done a lot of interviews with writers, and I think predominantly they say no, it doesn't. And Salman Rushdie gave me a very nice answer, which is that it's not that it gets easier, it's more difficult, but just that every book you write, you figure out how you have to write that particular book. And I was wondering what you thought of that, and also whether there is a moment in the writing which kind of unlocks and you think, there I have it, whether it's the point of view or the character, or just if there's just one element which makes you think, yes, now I have the key to the book.
I think Salman Rushdie's answer is spot on, actually, so I could just leave it there. But yeah, let me say a few things, because, I mean, to state the obvious, writing books is a very difficult thing. It's, you know, it's a slog, and it's basically an epic piece of architecture that you're putting together to make a construction where nothing was before. The design of it and how you go about it is entirely up to you. It can take a very long time to learn how to go about that. I mean, I certainly took far longer than my first, or even maybe my second published novel before I started to feel that I was beginning to get things under control in some way. But you're right, because that sense of control is something you fight for with each successive book. I think there probably are writers who like to write the same kind of book over and over, where it becomes a sort of a formula. Some of those books are highly successful, and their authors too. And I would speculate that for those authors, it doesn't get more difficult. It may get easier in a certain sense. For me, the difficulty is that it's boring to repeat yourself, even to yourself. So with each book, you want to kind of push into some thematic area or some area of technique or approach that you haven't in the past. And I certainly consciously frame those sorts of questions to myself. So if you're going to push, you know, into creative areas where you've never ventured before, there are new rules, and you have to discover what they are and how you can make them work for you. I forget how you phrased it exactly in your question, but for me, with each book, there is a moment where the book finds its voice, or I find the voice of the book, and that is the moment where I guess the book becomes something that you have to finish, and the only exit is sort of through the other end. Let me just say a word about voice, because people understand that in very different ways. I don't just mean, whether you're writing in the first person or the third person, although even those approaches have very different rules. I mean, there's a certain tone for every book, and there's a certain emotional range, and you have to establish what those things are. And then, of course, there is the practical question of, is this a third-person voice? What sort of voice is it? And if it's a first-person voice, is this a reliable voice? What do they know? What don't they know? In the case of this book, I did begin in a more, I don't know what the term would be, a more proscenium arch, front-on approach, the kind of conventional way you would write a novel in the third person. But it just was not taking, it had no yeast. It was not prose that was rising in the oven the way it was supposed to. And the key for me was breaking away from the book, actually, to do some work on a film script, and coming back to the book with the logic of the film script in my mind, because, again, film has a different voice to a novel. And you're not supposed to write in the way that a camera behaves. But for some reason, that was the narrative behavior that worked best for this book. I could feel it, and I went with it. It didn't quite erase my insecurity, because you're never sure with a book if it's actually working for anyone other than yourself. And that's obviously a very critical question.
But there's also something extraordinary that happens where we have this this very shifting point of view in terms of the narrator's voice. Sometimes we are inside, sometimes we are outside. We're in a scene, we could be in different people's heads. And there's this feeling of not quite knowing, not quite feeling like you know any of the characters intimately. And that was almost sort of what you intended to do, that there are maybe some that we feel, maybe I suppose Anton, for those of you who have read the book, I'm going to just assume that some of you, if you haven't, you should, that there's a sense of, okay, we know him a little bit more because maybe he's revealing more, and then other characters where they feel very ungraspable, although they're sort of, they have certain moral convictions, or sort of, I'm thinking of Amor as a character who is very far away and distant. And I was just wondering how these sort of tensions come about and how these decisions get made. I mean, there are writers who plan a lot, and I know that even in that planning things change. But sometimes also it just becomes evident in the writing. I think it was it Nabokov who said, my characters, I am the galley slave, or I am the galley master and they are my slaves, or something. So what kind of writer are you? And I'm curious, particularly in this book, how did that shifting narrator's voice come about?
Yeah, well, unlike Nabokov, I'm the guy who gets whipped by the characters, actually. They punish me daily. What you're referring to, I mean, the kind of ungraspable nature of the characters may be a function, actually, of the voice and the way it moves. Because if you wanted to approach this story, for want of a better word, in a more conventional way, you would have to have a lot more exposition. You would have to establish who the characters were, what their relationships were, etc., etc. None of that's really possible if your narrative eye is moving from this scene to a different scene to a different scene. So I decided not to fill in the blanks, to let the blanks, the kind of empty spaces that are, beyond the edges of the book, to be part of the book. That applies, the book's in 4 sections, jumping a decade more or less at a time through the last 40 years of South African history. So those jumps leave out a great deal. So that's already built into the book, that there's a lot that's not told to you, and you have to kind of imagine it when you pick up again 10 years later. This person's now decrepit, or that person's dead. what happened exactly, we don't know. That appeals to me because it requires of the reader a little bit of imaginative work. Every reader will imagine slightly differently what the fate of a character is. But it does extend to the narrative as well. And I remember lamenting to a writer friend while I was writing it that this is not like a book normally feels. Like, if I could use a painterly metaphor, your conventional book might involve flowing lines that join to make a coherent picture. This was more like trying to build up a picture with, little pointillistic dabs. You have a moment here, you have a moment there. And I thought, let it be. You get a sense of who these people are from how they behave, what they say, and what they feel in the moments you see them. And I, as an author, am not going to tell the reader any more than that. I realize it's not the way most people are used to reading. So the people who've been frustrated with my novel have mostly been frustrated with the voice.
Oh, okay. I wanted to ask about landscape, and as someone who has never been to South Africa, but who has dreamed of going to South Africa for many years, for various reasons, I don't know why, there's something where the landscape seems to have such an integral role in your writing, and you often have characters, not just in this book, who go on journeys or who are running away, and I wanted to maybe get you to talk a little bit about this sense of land and landscape as being somewhat treacherous, but also embracing or powerful and magnetic, and then the need to kind of go away and come back to it, and how that comes into play in your work, particularly, with South Africa.
Yeah, I recently did a car journey. I went to see my mother in Pretoria, where I grew up. I live in Cape Town, and driving back, I took a route I don't normally take, and it was very built up and horrible and full of trucks and buildings, and I was really sorry I'd gone that way. But then there came a point where the road broke free of, what you could call South Africa's social realities, and became, a road going through an empty landscape. And that landscape was really extraordinary. And I had the sense, which not for the first time, of how absolutely ugly South Africa's social realities are, and how astoundingly beautiful the backdrop is to those social realities. If you ever do visit, and I hope you do, you'll see it's one of the most varied and dramatic landscapes you could ever hope for. And of course, our history, which is played out against that landscape, is, almost immeasurably ugly and painful. So, the urge to escape the human realities and to take refuge in the natural realities is always there in South Africa. In a much deeper way for every South African writer, I think, it's a dilemma. How do you write about South Africa without writing about those social realities? The historical burden that all South Africans are saddled with, the political pain that's been dealt out, and so on. And honestly, the only ways I've managed to do that are either by setting a novel outside the country and focusing on, someone who's not South African, as in the case of E.M. Forster, or by focusing, as I did in another book, In a Strange Room, on travel, which is a kind of condition where one is stateless and without a past, and so on. So I could be a South African authentically not connected to South Africa's politics if I was writing about being somewhere else in a state of motion. But no, it's a very, I don't even know what the word for it is, but there's, every South African writer I know recognizes this dilemma. How do you talk about our country without talking about politics, essentially? Because political novels are not enticing as a concept, for a reader either, I don't think.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I remember listening to J.M. Coetzee talk at a conference many years ago, and he was saying how it turned out that one of his neighbors was on the sort of censor board, and his novels had not been censored, and this idea that when you are writing in a sort of time where it's difficult to say something directly, so you resort to parable or metaphor or
allegory,
satire. Yes, yeah. And then it's just sort of like, well, they don't get it, and so your book sort of slides through. It's too clever, or they, that sense of the roundabout way, but at the same time. That question, I suppose, I have a wonderful friend who's a Lebanese poet, and she said, sometimes I just want to write a love poem. And there's this expectation also, if you come from certain places, that you must write about certain things. And I was wondering whether it's even possible is it possible to be a South African writer and not write a political novel on whatever level, however you want to define political?
Well, I mean, there are ways people have found to evade it, and you've named some of them exactly, I mean, through Coetzee. Coetzee, I think, quite famously got attacked or, accused, at least by Nadine Gordimer, of evading those realities, of not taking a side, not planting his flag, hiding in, oblique ways from... I mean, I don't subscribe to that view, just to be clear, but, I don't know. A South African novel that made a big impression a few years ago was a science fiction book called Zoo City, I think, Lauren Bierkes. So, science fiction, speculative fiction is another way of evading the present, I guess.
Yeah.
But you can't look at the present without looking at the past in South Africa, unfortunately. It's that freighted with history.
And there's a line that Oki, who's one of my favorite characters in the book, says, just can we turn off the political news and concentrate on the view or look at the view or something? And I thought that was something that perhaps even in India today, there's a lot of writers who are thinking about these things of how to, go through this question of writing and acknowledging the realities, but also not go into propaganda. But one question I wanted to ask was about a phrase you use, blood loyalty, which I was really interested in, because I think in the same way that the idea of the family is, of course, in some cultures wonderful, but also always oppressive. And I wondered in your work, how do you feel you work against or toward this idea of blood loyalty? Because the character of Amor is really trying to do this thing, which is to give the house that her mother extracted the promise from the father, saying you will give it to Salome, the black maid, and this is sort of the whole impetus for the book. And in a way, it's sort of the suffocation of family that comes out very strongly, although there are moments.
Yeah, I suppose most people feel their family as some kind of a, I don't even know what the word is. I mean, there are happy families, but everyone feels them as some kind of a pressure or a weight of some sort. And partly it is that notion of blood loyalty, that this is your clan, these are your people, whatever happens to all of you in some sense. But in a funny way, that's kind of the mindset South Africa needs to break free from, because it's so fragmented that people identify with their group as opposed to the larger group of the nation. And that breaks down on a much more granular level to a family level. So you don't go against your family. You don't do what's against your family's interests. But in a larger sense, your family is part of, I mean, in my case, okay, so white South Africa. When writers like Gordimer or Coetzee spoke out against the South African state, it was seen, understood by a lot of white readers as betrayal. A lot of people, hate them as writers because of what they represent. And that's going against a kind of a blood loyalty. I mean, of course, white South Africa is not my family, but there is the sense that this is us, and there's a them. Usually the them, lies elsewhere, but as you might be discovering in India, it's very possible to create those lines of division internally and make that us and them feeling very much part of a nation too. It's about breaking people apart, you know, divide and rule, but let's...
Yeah, yeah. I wanted to ask a question about, I guess, a sense of, you know, whether there is a sense of and I use the word delicately, moral code or a moral universe that you think that the writer operates from. And I use moral not in a sense of, you know, finger wagging, this is good, but a sense of when you read a book, when you read a novel and you're immersed in it, you have a sense of there is a moral universe, a moral pendulum, without it telling you what to do and telling you what to think. Do you have a sense of that, or are you trying to just, I don't know, destabilize people and just make them ask a lot of questions? Because that's a feeling I read with so many questions in this book, and it was really...
Well, you see,
yeah.
I have a kind of a personal theory about the novel, which, you know, may not actually academically apply, so I stand to be corrected. But it feels to me as if the novel is a form which grew as a kind of a diversion, entertainment for the upper classes, you know, even say middle classes. And as such, it's meant to reflect the values of readers back to them. So it's kind of, it's built into the DNA of the novel that things resolve and that people who act badly are punished and that good people are rewarded. I mean, that's kind of what novels for a very long time served up. The very operation of a plot implies a kind of rupture in the moral universe, and what keeps you reading is the expectation that that rupture will be healed, and it's part of the satisfying shape of a book that it ultimately usually is. And it's anti-literary, in a sense, not to resolve the book, not to have people that you recognize as good or bad, and so on. But I don't think that paradigm actually applies to the real world. If you look at the real world, I mean, terrible dictators die peacefully in old age, you know, people you would think of as good, moral people are not rewarded for their efforts. Very often, people who behave badly are. So how do you move the novel with its set of expectations, which each new reader brings to it? How do you move the novel into territory that more closely reflects the operation of the real world? So, I mean, I can give you concrete examples, maybe in the case of this book. Firstly, I don't think there are many characters there that your average reader would think of as good people. Nobody is rewarded or punished in particular. And the resolution of the novel, which revolves around this promise that gets made to the black lady who works for this family, that she'll get this horrible broken down house on the useless piece of land, which in itself is not very alluring, takes, you know, a very long time to be fulfilled, and when it is ultimately fulfilled, it's extremely compromised, open to question, and uncertain. So, to my mind, that was a way of providing the requisite shape for a book, the resolution, but also opening questions for the readers as to what that resolution actually means for these people. It seems to me, you know, yeah, I'm also capable of reading a book for the kind of pleasure of feeling, that worked out well, glad for those people closing it and leaving it. But I forget that book instantly. The books I don't forget are the ones that are open-ended in some way, that are unresolved, that leave you with a sense of being morally troubled by something. That seems to me a much more useful effect, if you like, for a novel, because there is a vague hope that a reader will take that sense of being bothered or disturbed into the world with them and bring it to bear the next time they encounter a problem that might be similar. You know, if we're to believe that books, you know, are there to improve the world in any way, I think there's more hope of it by disturbing people than by consoling them, essentially.
I just want to say, I mean, we've been talking about the book and all these very serious things, but I also found the book to be, like, I laughed a lot, and I thought it was very funny, and I want to emphasize that in all of this stuff about power and hierarchy and land and the symbol of the house and the, you know, falling apart of the family, there's, I think, at least the narrator or the voice or whoever that mystical figure is, you, alter ego, is having a lot of fun. And there's this real sharp laughter that there were moments, and I've written ha ha in the margin, and really I think more unexpected, because you're going from this weightiness and this, you know, the inequalities and this injustice, and suddenly there's a real swipe, there's a real. And it struck me that you probably, I don't know, did you have a lot of fun writing this book, more than with, say, other books, where you just said, I'm just going to do this, I like it, and I'm saying what I want with this, yeah, really like a kind of scorpion tail humor. Is that fair?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the issue of humor, because it was a kind of a vital element for me, and hopefully for the reader too. I mean, it's a book about death and decay and, you know, moral turpitude, so you need a laugh. And I guess the function of that narrative voice is to enable the reader to locate themselves outside this family sometimes, to look at these deeds and thoughts and so on from outside and feel, there are other perspectives, some of them funny, from which we can view these otherwise really quite depressing events. Not all readers have picked up the note of humor, it has to be said, you know, and if you don't, I think it's pretty bleak. So you need to bring a sense of humor along with you for the ride, I guess.
Yes. No, okay, we have 10 minutes, so I want to open it up for questions. Does anybody have questions?
There is someone there.
Yes. Hi.
Hi.
Hi. So for me, your prose is so exceptionally evocative. You mentioned that you went and kind of wrote a film script and came back to it, and for me, that kind of really described the cinematic kind of way that it came across. You know, you could feel the sensations, you could kind of just kind of see the color in the way that you wrote. But you also described your writing process as kind of, it felt very arduous to you and kind of a bit of a slog and architectural. And I was wondering, kind of, from in your processes, how do you kind of craft your color and your sensations and your feelings, you know, when you're also kind of feeling that inside in terms of your emotional response to your own writing?
Thanks, it's a good question. And thanks for the compliment, by the way, I appreciate that too. I do find writing horribly hard. I mean, I think almost more than any other writer I know, I complain and lament and whine and feel sorry for myself. But it's up to a point, and that point is usually what I mentioned, where the book finds its voice. It's like I know this book wants to speak. I can feel it. I can feel it has a life. It has a being, but I cannot hear the voice. And it's like trying to crack a code in a safe. And when you do, when the voice of the book it speaks through you in a way, you have the key, and basically the safe opens, and then it becomes a lot more pleasurable. So if there is any vividness to my writing, it comes in that stage of the book, which tends to be draft 2 or 3. So it's the first draft that's like mud wrestling, basically. Mud wrestling has its pleasures.
So Damon, you spoke about South Africa being a fragmented society, the us and them. I've had the good fortune of actually visiting it for a couple of years. We did a festival called Shared Histories. And I worked with young people in Soweto, in Manenberg, which is near Durban, so really marginalized and, you know, young people struggling for opportunity. But I heard a very interesting phrase there called reverse colonialism, where there is now reservation, apparently, for seats in schools and universities, and I had white African students come up and say that though they made, the cut was, you know, the marks were better than the black students, there wasn't enough seats for them. So I'm just wondering, have you experienced this thing of reverse colonialism, of, you know, now it's like, what do I say, you know, the blacks coming back, or a more balance of power? Because it is about power right now.
I haven't directly experienced it. I, you know, was an adult and already laboring at this futile pursuit by the time apartheid fell. So I was never in a position where that might have affected me. I do hear it from the parents of friends who are concerned about their children. But the fact remains that the South African economy is still absolutely dominated by white people who have every advantage that superior finances will bring. So, you know, if you have money, you go to the best schools, which gives you the best opportunities for scholarships, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, I'm not in the firing line and probably shouldn't plant my flag too bravely, but it seems to me, you know, these quota systems and so on are a very necessary corrective to what has been the opposite. For decades and decades and decades in South Africa, where absolutely everything that mattered or that meant something was kept for white people. How do you even the playing field without kind of forcing it? You know, there are all sorts of compromises involved where you have to drop standards and so on. I'm not involved in the thick of it, and I can't really sort of comment, but I think it's just going to be a very, very bumpy, long period in history before South Africa's over its mess of a past. And that's a small amount of collateral damage, considering the, you know, the actual damage done. Yeah. Somebody.
Hello, I'm Gudmundur. I had the pleasure of being ambassador to your country from Iceland for 5 or 6 years, and, until I guess 7 years ago. So I lived many of the things that you're describing, in particular what I just heard from the last question. And you spoke about not, and many authors not speaking about politics, but I really would look forward to you writing something about politics.
Me? I mean, I'm not sure how to respond to that, because the word politics has a lot of connotations. It depends on how you understand it. If I think of the political novel, I think of a kind of book that I wouldn't want to read and therefore definitely wouldn't want to write. But of course, politics, as you would appreciate, is something we live every day. You know, policies are one thing, the way the implications of such policies affect people's lives. And really, novels are focused on that, the tissue of people's lives, what works, what doesn't, what's fair, what's not fair. So you could say every novel, in a certain sense, is political. Instead of the word political, I've always tried to think of history instead. We're all products of our time and place, whether we like to think of ourselves that way or not. And, you know, a novel can take account of that, a novel from wherever. South Africa happens to be saturated with political analysis, so it tends to be much more self-conscious, that kind of deliberation. I could have responded with an anecdote to Tishani earlier, and I will throw it out now. When I started writing, I was very young and in a privileged position, and I believed art was apolitical, and I wanted to write apolitical books. I've noticed that people who call themselves apolitical are almost always in the comfortable seats. If you're at the receiving end of an unjust political system, you are almost never apolitical. You know what's put you there. But my first book is something I'd prefer to forget, but the second one dealt with something very, very personal to me, which was about being really, really sick as a small boy. and the sickness, for various reasons, tore my family apart. Tragic if you look at it on a small scale. And I felt absolutely entitled to write about that, and I felt it was really strong material for a novel. But a couple of reviews really smacked me in a more general sense by saying, who is this privileged white boy who thinks his own personal troubles are more important than the troubles of his nation? I mean, the country was burning at the time. That's probably not an accusation novelists from most countries would ever have to deal with, but it really brought me up short. It was the first time I sat and consciously faced up to the fact that I come from a country that was in crisis, still is in crisis, different crisis, and that in some way, if you want to measure up to a country like that, you have to take history into account. So I think of it as history rather than politics. You know, for a lot of readers, The Promise is quite a political book. There's not a single political party named in there. The only names of politicians are the names of the different presidents, each one occurring once in each section of the book, and yet it's full of politics. What happens in the state happens in the home, I think, in some way. You can be alert to that, pay attention to it as a writer, or ignore it. I try to some extent to pay attention to it, but also never to forget the fact that books are about people, and the way people live is different to the way policies work, I guess. So it's about seeing the human being through the cracks of history, if you like. That sounds like a pretentious phrase I'll probably regret later.
But it's also so much about power and hierarchies, and it's not just this book, and that is political, absolutely. In your book about E.M. Forster, Arctic Summer, there's this sense of imperialism, even if it's to do with relationships or sexual relationships, or so everything is political in some way. But I think it's more this sense of who has the power, who is wielding that power, who is trying to get power, and that's, I would say, absolutely of the essence political. Do we have time for one more question before we close, or yeah? Does anybody? Yes.
Tishani, I'm very pleased you picked up on the humorous point as well. I think that was written to Sonu last night, and he said it was one of the funniest books he's actually read. And also, both Damon and Claire mentioned the sort of cinematographic take of how the book is shot. So we're looking at a sort of literal genre screenplay. I was just wondering if you have any plans for a play.
Yes, actually. We're in the throes of putting together a theatre production of The Promise to run later in the year, in September, in Cape Town and in Johannesburg at the Market Theatre. And we hope to travel the play elsewhere. So if there are any willing venues, you can sign up later. But yeah, we have a very, very well cast, very well supported production in progress. I've done the script. I didn't quite plan to, but somehow it happened. And yeah, I'm really excited. I mean, my early life had roots in theatre, and it affects almost everything I write, actually, in ways that may not be obvious. And it's been very, I mean, a play of The Promise is a very different creature to the book. The rules are different. The organism is a different living thing. And you have to make it live and behave on its own terms. But we're in the process of doing that. So, yeah, we'll see where that goes. Thanks for that question.